Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
There's a structural problem with genocide, which is that it tends to happen in places that are off the beaten path.
So now, in order to promote nonviolence and reduce violence, ultimately we have to address the motivation.
Society needs to acknowledge that learning is a lifelong challenge.
The sit-ins challenge cherished beliefs most whites held dearly.
At the DNA level, we're all 99.9% the same, all of us.
So individuals do matter, and I think the quality of our individual leadership matters.
Who is speaking for poor people? 40 million Americans make $6 an hour. Who is speaking for them?
The only thing that one has after throwing everything overboard is the love that one can give.
My perspectives on America's educational system, particularly on the black-white test score gap, changed dramatically on August 29, 2005. This was the day that Hurricane Katrina devastated Louisiana and other parts of the Gulf Coast. Before I witnessed the horrors of this event, I had always considered myself to be a very progressive teacher-educator, activist, and researcher committed to the reformation of schools in order to provide equal educational opportunities for all students, but particularly low-income and African-American students. However, as I watched the national response to this disaster grow more shameful each day, I was further convinced that the reformation of schools was not enough. What I came to know is that if African American students are to succeed in schools, both schools and society have to be dramatically transformed, not merely reformed. Why did the worst natural disaster recorded in U.S. history change how I think about schools and African American school achievement? Well, unlike other natural disasters of the past, Katrina came ashore and uncovered what many Americans preferred not to see: poverty, racism, classism, arrogance of power, and decades of neglect. Although the damage and destruction of this hurricane cut across racial and economic lines, FEMA data and satellite maps confirmed that poor African American residents of New Orleans and their children were disproportionately displaced and suffered the greatest loss. Hence, Hurricane Katrina is a symbol of what can happen when a nation systematically and unabashedly abandons the most vulnerable. I do not want to be misunderstood on this point. Most Americans, as individuals or members of organized groups, responded to Hurricane Katrina with generous donations of money, service, sympathy, and incalculable acts of kindness. As American citizens and individuals, we should all be very proud of these efforts to help those in need. However, there are financial, emotional, and physical limitations to individuals' and groups' ability to sustain altruism over time. I believe that the images of desperate and abandoned people literally drowning under the weight of poverty were too heavy a burden to bear for the average person, because watching bore an acknowledgement and ultimately a responsibility to act. Still, others struggle with what was called, quote, compassion fatigue, blaming the displaced for their predicament, reproaching them for their dire circumstances in which they found themselves. Often the popular media exploited this perception by portraying the poor as ignorant, lazy, welfare-dependent people who did not heed the warning to evacuate, or worse, looters and criminals who took advantage of the disaster. Compassion fatigue and victim blaming were predictable responses, not only to hurricanes, but to the entrenching problems of African American school failure. Again, because individuals' hard work and Herculean efforts can never be a substitution for focusing on identifying the causes and the solutions to poverty and racism at the larger societal level. Michael Eric Dyson accurately portrayed that, quote, episodes of goodwill and compassion are no replacement for structural change. Charity can never be a substitution for justice, quote. So here we are, nearly 18 months after Hurricane Katrina, and New Orleans children are still drowning in poor schools, in crime, poor health care, inadequate housing, hopelessness, and inexcusable poverty. What do we know about poverty? We know that structural changes are required to decrease the poverty rate and to increase African American achievement rate in schools. The U.S. Census Bureau reported that the poverty rate rose last year when 1.1 million more individuals were living in poverty than a year earlier. America's poverty rate is the highest among developed nations. The numbers are equivalent to the population of Canada. Any documentation of long-term and consistent attention to the issues of poverty are absent from the record. Some progress was made during President Johnson's war on poverty in the 60s. However, the war on poverty ended as a resounding defeat as politicians waved the white flag of surrender, signaling a retreat from the poor and the defenseless. Perhaps the most painful lesson Katrina taught us was how this country devalues children. What do we know about these children? Well, according to the Children's Defense Fund, each day in America, over 2,000 babies are born in poverty each day. 367 babies are born to mothers who have received no or late prenatal care. 1,700 babies are born each day in this country without health insurance. What do we then know about poverty and race? These data on poverty cannot be disconnected from the issues of race and racism. There's a strong relationship between the two. A recent Urban Institute report documented that even when statistically controlling for factors like differences in parents' employment, family structure, parents' education, that African American children are still twice as likely to be poor than white children. In an informative piece called The Hidden Cost of Being African American, Shapiro states that the average African American family holds 10 cents of wealth for every dollar that whites possess. Making the distinction between wealth and income, Shapiro noted that the income gap actually, that's job salaries and wages, well, the income gap actually narrowed in the 2000s when the average African American family earned 64 cents for every dollar earned by white families. But wealth, well, wealth is another issue. The primary sources of wealth are home ownership, home equity, as well as stocks, bonds, and savings that are passed on from one generation to the next. This wealth, as contrasted to income, is called a transformative asset. So in 2005, 75% of white households owned their homes, compared to 46% for black households and 48% for Hispanic households. These discouraging race and poverty data are related to larger and more systemic issues of school equality. And I want to use two examples to illustrate this point. One is segregation and the other the test score gap. What do we know about school segregation? The Civil Rights Project and the Educational Testing Service provide some rather sobering statistics on segregation. Segregation actually has been on the rise in the last decade, despite rapid increases in the number of ethnically and culturally diverse students. Census Bureau data indicate that the white population is declining and the percentage of ethnic groups is increasing. Currently, 40% of this nation's school children come from ethnically diverse backgrounds. And in some large urban school districts, more than half of the students are diverse. However, this growing diversity does not foretell growing integration. The average African American child in this country attends a school that is 67% African American and 75% poor. Recent publication from the National Bureau of Economic Research included statistical models for school and neighborhood segregation. And I find it interesting that they concluded that the black-white test score gap is related to neighborhood segregation and that, quote, neighborhood composition matters more than school composition, quote. Why? Because so-called integrated schools are often segregated schools, where students of color attend low-track classes taught by inexperienced teachers, and where white students are overrepresented in honors, AP, and college prep courses. Nevertheless, residential segregation, supported by decades of reversals of school busing cases, particularly in medium and urban areas, has been on the rise. In 2000, the average white person in this country lived in a neighborhood that was 89% white. The other contributing factor to school segregation is an increase in private school enrollment by white students. Studies by Yearding and Young and Kozel found that white private school enrollment today is comparable to the percentages reported in 1968. What do we know about the test score gap? The test score gap refers to the difference between the scores of African American and Hispanic students as compared to their white and Asian counterparts. This test score gap is revealed by the fact that white students on the average will score 20 to 30 points higher than their African American and Hispanic peers. 17-year-old African American students, by the way, have skills in reading, math, and science that are similar to those of a 13-year-old white student. The so-called new revised SAT has produced the same old score gaps. Black test takers, 93 points lower than whites in critical reading, 107 points lower in math, 91 points lower in writing. Interesting, the test score gap exists even when researchers control for social class. In other words, when middle and upper middle income African American students are compared to their social class counterparts, the gap persists. We know that low school achievement and dropping out of school have major implications for the economic survivability of this nation. The estimated economic cost of low achievement, well, a high school dropout earns $260,000 less over a lifetime than a high school graduate, and hence pays less taxes and less Social Security. This economy loses $192 billion with each cohort of 18-year-olds who never complete high school. Well, are there strategies then that schools can adopt to address this test score gap? What can schools do? First, we need more competent and caring teachers. Although psychological, economic, and sociological perspectives do explain the underachievement of African American students, convincing data show that recruiting, training, and retaining quality teachers for low-income students of color are significant and likely solutions to the problem. We know both instinctively and empirically that, quote, what matters most, quote, are competent, highly qualified, caring teachers in our nation's classrooms. Most educators, researchers, and the general public agree that the quality of a student's teacher is the single most important variable in closing the achievement gap. Addressing the teacher quality factor in low-performing schools is even more critical. A report on public school students' access to well-qualified teachers concluded, quote, if states hope to close the achievement gap between minority and non-minority students and those from rich and poor families, they must first close the gap in access to skilled teachers. The data are consistent and convincing that not all students have so-called skilled teachers. The reality is that the most effective teachers are found in schools where they are needed the least. Students in predominantly African American, Hispanic, high poverty, and urban schools are twice as likely as students in other schools to be taught by the most inexperienced teachers. Richard Ingersoll's work documented that the solution to the problem is not merely about recruiting, but it's also a retention problem. High poverty schools that serve culturally diverse students have difficulty keeping experienced teachers. Half of the teachers leave urban schools in the first 3 years of teaching. The cost of this teacher turnover, $2.6 billion annually. Lack of experience is not the only factor that contributes to this test score gap. Teachers in high poverty schools are also likely to be uncertified and to teach subjects in which they did not even have a college minor. In order to close the achievement gap, students need high quality teachers throughout their schooling. What else can we do? We need new pedagogical models to instruct African American students. This point focuses on pedagogy and answers the question about what we teach and how we teach. Regarding mastery of the subject matter content, closing the achievement gap requires that every teacher have a thorough and deep understanding of the subjects they teach. This deep understanding of the content knowledge allows teachers to employ multiple representations of knowledge that use students' everyday lived experiences to motivate and assist students in connecting new knowledge to home, community, and global settings. Teachers have to revise how they teach. Specifically, they need to acquire culturally responsive pedagogical skills. These are skills that require teachers to understand that students' learning is influenced by their social and cultural experiences. And in order to maximize student achievement, teachers must gain knowledge of the history and cultures represented in their classrooms and infuse this knowledge into everyday instructional practices. I argue that demographic changes in today's schools demand new ways of organizing and implementing instruction. Diverse students bring a range of cultural and everyday lived experiences that may be different from the teacher's knowledge, beliefs, and views, and certainly they're often different from the dominant norms of the school. As part of meaningful instruction for diverse learners, educators must consider the language and the textbooks used to represent concepts and ideas and must find ways to better connect with the realities that students know and live in order to help them to understand instruction. We need teachers who are well prepared, competent in their subject matter. They're advocates for their students. They teach their students about issues of social justice. They're change agents and leaders in their schools and their communities. They understand how to involve their students' parents. These teachers are problem solvers who search for insight in how culture and ethnicity influence teaching and learning. We need teachers to include the history of diverse groups in their instruction, no matter what the content area they teach. We need teachers who use culturally relevant and student-generated images, examples, metaphors, teachers who understand students' learning preferences, who share ownership of the lessons with their students, and who use a variety of formative and summative assessment tools informed by their own teaching as well as standardized tests. We need new models in teacher education. We are interested in the transformation of structural systems of inequality. Too often, we hesitate to share our beliefs and political stances for reasons we all know. However, we need to do this more often. Our pre- and in-service teachers, students' beliefs are unlikely to be replaced with more positive ones unless they prove to be unsatisfactory. And they're not likely to prove unsatisfactory unless they are challenged. I think all of these strategies I just mentioned deserve our attention and commitment. However, I'm arguing here that implementing any school intervention without due attention to changing more systemic issues of structural inequality will have limited effects. There are achievement gap issues that schools cannot solve alone. So, the first item on the agenda is to employ a paradigm shift in the education profession. A wider lens that expands our current narrow view. Understandably, many educators choose to zoom in on individual students or individual classrooms, cropping out the broader context or the backgrounds of the subject of focus. There's a story about teachers that I think captures this phenomenon. Anthropologist Lauren Isley calls the story the starfish thrower. Once upon a time, there was a famous writer who walked the beach each day before he began his work. One day, as he was walking along the shore, he saw a young boy picking up something and very gently throwing it into the ocean. As he got close, he called out, "Good morning, boy. What are you doing?" The boy replied, "Throwing starfish in the ocean." The writer responded, "Why are you throwing starfish in the ocean?" The boy said, "Well, the sun is up, the tide is going out, and if I don't throw them in, well, they'll die." "But young man," said the writer, "don't you realize that there are miles and miles of beaches with starfish all along them? You can't possibly make a difference." The young man listened politely, then bent down and picked up another starfish. He threw it in the sea, past the breaking waves, and said, "It made a difference for that one." This story ends up with the adage that teachers are like the boy in the story, starfish throwers, making a difference one child at a time. This inspirational story that teachers tell all of the time about making a difference one child at a time, I think has some inherent limitations. I am not convinced that the boy's plan to save starfish is the best strategy to employ. I admire the boy's hard work, his concern, and his commitment. However, the man and the boy should find the space and the time to find out, well, why are so many starfish ashore, and why do they die, and how might more be saved? The solutions require the sustained efforts and the expertise of an entire community: climatologists, ecologists, marine biologists, environmentalists, community organizers, educators, and yes, ordinary citizens. Concomitantly, there are fundamental problems when educators just think of themselves as mainly starfish throwers. What happens to the other students in a teacher's class while the starfish thrower is saving the one student who needs help? How does the teacher decide who should be the focus of her attention when so many students need help? What happens when the child rescued in the 3rd grade ends up in the classroom with a non-starfish thrower teacher in the 4th grade? How many starfish throwers are needed to make a lasting and significant difference in society? I think part of the paradigm shift in thinking about the achievement gap is to help educators understand that, well, politics is really not a dirty word. We have to understand that our work in schools is as much about politics as it is pedagogy. The point is that political influences have a great deal to do with the outcomes of our work, and we cannot make long-term differences by just saving one starfish at a time. I believe that we cannot move the equity agenda forward in K-12 schooling until we address the primary questions. Who makes the critical decisions about education? Who controls the curriculum, the assessment, the policies, and the money? In conclusion, the Educational Testing Service published the result of a review of thousands of pieces of empirical research in order to determine what we know about achieving a quality education for all children. They identified correlates of achievement that they call, quote, unambiguous. Students, but particularly low-income students of color, need well-prepared, competent, and qualified teachers. Students need experienced teachers who remain at the school and come to work regularly. Students need a challenging academic curriculum. Low-income, ethnic, diverse, and limited English-speaking students need adequately funded schools with small classes. Schools must eliminate the digital divide. Schools have to be safe havens, free of disruption, violence, and fear. ETS continues with its recommendations by underscoring schools cannot close the achievement gap simply by concentrating on school variables. Parents need assistance and support in helping their children. High student mobility needs to be decreased and affordable housing increased. Pregnant women need high-quality prenatal care. Children need regular pediatric care. No child should ever come to school or leave school hungry. Starting at infancy, children should be exposed to books. We desperately need more summer, after-school, and parenting program. And lastly, the number of single-parent homes in this country must be decreased. We cannot close the achievement gap if we cannot close these other gaps. We have to close the teacher quality gap, the challenging curriculum gap, the school funding gap. We have to close the digital divide gap, the wealth and income gap, parenting skills gap, employment opportunity gap. We have to close the affordable housing gap, healthcare gap, nutrition gap, the integration gap, and quality child care gap. We must act, not by saving one African American child at a time, but by working on the institutionalization of structures and policies that protect, educate, and nurture all children. What do we know and what can we do? I think it's obvious that we already have the knowledge, skills, and the technology to effectively educate African American students in this country. What we lack visionary leaders and ordinary citizens who have both conscience and courage. Ron Edmonds, the trailblazer of the school reform movement, noted 30-plus years ago that we already know all we need to know to provide a quality education for all children. He said the critical question to be raised is, how do we feel about the fact that we have not yet done it? Thank you very much.